So for this prediction, we're going to be using economic data, and this is to ensure any sort of political bias doesn't come into the mix. Now, some will say that this data isn't perfect, and you're probably correct. Imagine how hard it would be to get accurate data on over 300 million people in this nation. But nonetheless, this is the data that we have and the data that we're going to use. Here's why I'm using economic data for this prediction. It's because of this old adage that people vote with their wallets. Meaning simply this: if the economy is doing well, people will vote for the party that's currently in the White House. And if the economy isn't doing so well, the incumbent party will likely be voted against. And yes, this video was made just before the very contested 2024 presidential election between current Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. But since we're using economic data that goes back over 70 years, the info contained in this video is applicable to any election going forward when it comes to making a prediction. But right now we find ourselves in a very unique economic position where inflation was just the worst it's been in over 40 years. You can see the spike right here. But recently it's cooled down and it's gotten very close to the 2% target range that the Federal Reserve aims for. Now, this means that people are definitely still feeling the pain from this previous inflation spike, and they're very upset about it, and rightly so. But it has been 2 years since this spike, and where it stands right now, inflation is nearly fully under control, once again, based off the Federal Reserve's parameters. So will people remember this inflation from 2 years ago and vote accordingly, or have voters just become fatigued with this inflation argument, especially with recent data coming in very favorable? So let's get right into this. The first piece of economic data we're going to look at is something that's very familiar to everybody. This is the unemployment rate. Whenever unemployment spikes, as you can see right here, it's always followed by a recession, which you can also see here represented with these dark gray shaded areas. But now we're going to look a little bit closer at all of these spikes and see if a spike in unemployment played a role in election outcomes. Okay, let's quickly review the first two election cycles so we can understand how this indicator is going to work. So right here, November 1948, the Democrats are the incumbents and unemployment is low. This means the Democrats should remain in power based off this unemployment reading. And yes, the Democrats do remain in control, therefore confirming this election predictor. Now, let's move on to November 1952. As you can see, unemployment is very low. It's actually lower than it was before this election. So if this indicator was 100% correct, you could automatically assume the Democrats would remain in control, but they didn't. The beloved World War II General Dwight D. Eisenhower was the Republican challenger and was victorious. At this time, Americans were very upset with the Korean War, and they assumed Eisenhower would be able to get them out of that mess. Nonetheless, this is an example of unemployment not confirming an election outcome. But as we begin to zoom out and parse through the rest of the data leading up to the present time, we're going to quickly see how accurate these economic data points are at predicting elections. Since 1948, there's only been 3 election cycles where the outcome was not correlated with the unemployment data. We reviewed one in 1952. The next was 1968, where unemployment was very low, but there were many social issues plaguing the nation. And then more recently in 2016, when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, when unemployment was sharply declining. And that means that out of the last 19 election cycles, 16 of them could have been predicted accurately by using unemployment data. That's an 84.2% accuracy rate. And if we look over here to the right towards the present day in 2024, unemployment's on the rise. And anytime unemployment has spiked like this, it's always resulted in a recession. But will it confirm the election outcome? According to all the data we've looked at, there's an 84.2% chance that the incumbent Democrats will be unseated by the Republicans. Let's move on to the next economic data point. This is the Sahm Rule recession indicator. How this indicator is calculated is a little bit complex, but it essentially tracks sharp movements in unemployment compared to previous data. And you can see anytime the blue line rises well above zero, it's 100% accurate in predicting a recession. But can it predict an election? There are many election cycles on this chart where the indicator was not triggered, so I'm going to bypass those election cycles as they don't pertain to this analysis. Instead, I'm going to focus on election cycles that happened right around these spikes in the Sahm Rule and see if it's accurate in predicting the upcoming 2024 election and all elections going forward when there's spikes in the Sahm Rule like there is right now. First up is the election of 1960. The Sahm Rule was triggered, meaning that the incumbent Republicans should have been unseated by the Democrats, and they were. The Democratic challenger, John F. Kennedy, was victorious, therefore confirming the first example of the Sahm Rule being an accurate predictor of an election outcome. Next is 1972, and the Republicans are the incumbents. As you can see, the Sahm Rule was triggered in late 1969, nearly 3 years before this election of 1972. And many Americans blame the economic stagnation on the Democrats who were previously in power. So by the time the election of 1972 rolled around, the economy was much stronger and the Republicans remained in control. Nonetheless, based off the Sahm Rule alone, it did not accurately predict the election outcome. This is the only example that the Sahm Rule did not accurately predict the election up until present day. As we zoom out, we can see the Sahm Rule being triggered at these dates, where it accurately predicted the election outcome, which means it was correct in predicting the election outcome 7 out of 8 times with an accuracy rate of 87.5%. And one interesting side note is that the Sahm Rule can go negative when unemployment is going down and the economy is rapidly improving. And the lowest reading there ever was on the Sahm Rule was here in 1983 when Ronald Reagan was president. 1 year later, he won re-election by the largest landslide margin of victory in United States history, hinting that Americans were likely voting with their wallets and wanted this economic boom to continue under the incumbent Republican Reagan. The final economic indicator we're going to look at is the relationship between the 10-year Treasury and the 2-year Treasury. This is better known as the yield curve. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of explaining the details of the yield curve because I don't want to confuse anyone or get too off topic. So if you're curious, you can research it on your own. It's actually very simple. Now, anytime the yield curve inverts, it's a bad sign for the economy. And that's represented on this chart here when this blue line goes below 0, hence an inversion. But the recessions related to the yield curve, they don't happen when it first becomes inverted. The recessions take place after the yield curve uninverts or comes back above 0. And this is very clearly seen here in the late 80s, 1989. This blue line goes below 0, and then when it becomes inverted, and then it uninverts, and by the early 90s, there's a recession. One thing to take note of is that not every recession is paired with an inversion of the yield curve. But every time the yield curve inverts, there has been a recession. Now, what I mean by that is take a look here in 2020. There was a very short recession around the time that COVID came around. But there was no inversion of the yield curve, even though it was pretty close. But if you look at 1978, 89, 2000, and 2006, the yield curve inverted all 4 of those times, and every time it led to a recession. And something else that happened during all 4 of those inversions was that the incumbent presidential party was unseated by the challenging party. So the yield curve has been correct at predicting presidential elections 4 out of 4 times with an accuracy rate of 100%. But will the current unwinding of the yield curve lead to a recession? And if so, will it happen in time to affect the election outcome? That's the big question. So based off the data we've reviewed, at the present time, it's somewhat likely that Donald Trump will be victorious in November. But remember, inflation is cooling off and the stock market has been quite resilient as of late, so anything can happen. Now, to close this video out, here's a very interesting set of stats related to the stock market in election years. So let's listen in.
This is a time where, regardless if it's Democrat or Republican, that the financial markets typically do well during this period of time. And we've already seen that happen this year. But people still get concerned about it.
There have been several studies looking into this. A Fidelity study found during an election year, the stock market, on average, goes up around 9%. The year after an election, the market goes up, on average, around 8%. And the study found it doesn't appear to matter who is on the ballot.
So while we can use economic indicators to predict these election outcomes, how is this going to help us? We now see that the stock market will continue to go up regardless who's in office during the election year or even who's on the ballot. And with all of this being known, it's very important to continue making progress by starting and growing your investments to ensure that you have a secure and a happy financial future, regardless of what's going on around you in the world. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can be notified of all my upcoming videos. And if you have any thoughts or questions, leave a comment below. A lot of time goes into making these videos for you, and I strive to deliver the most valuable information in exchange for your time. So for that, I thank you very much. This is Power of the Dollar, and I'll see you next time.